Hello, everyone. I'm sorry that you can't see me right now. We're working desperately to try to get our internet back, but in the meantime, I just want to welcome everyone. I'm the president of Northwest Suburban Chicago Chapter of NOW, and I'd like to welcome you to our meeting featuring Gail Schechter, a leader in tenant and community organizing, who currently is the executive director of the Housing Opportunities and Maintenance for the Elderly, or H.O.M.E. Gail is a widely recognized thought leader in implementing grassroots strategies for fostering inclusive, just, and diverse communities. Tonight, we are fortunate to have her share her lessons learned from more than 36 years of activism for housing justice. Now, as Executive Director of H.O.M.E, she provides intergenerational housing and support services for low-income seniors throughout the city of Chicago. I plan to pay close attention to Gail's discussion of how fair housing benefits women and how we can support these efforts. Please note that during Gail's presentation, we'll place everyone on mute, like Ed did. And so save your questions and comments until after her presentation, when we open the meeting up to discussion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Gail Schechter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Iris and Ed, and all of you for coming to this presentation. I have to say this is a labor of love. This has been a 36-year labor of love, and I'm glad to see all of you. I have to say that NOW was my very first foray into activism.
Okay.
When I was a teenager at Hunter College High School in New York, I was somehow recruited to help address envelopes and postcards to help pass the Equal Rights Amendment. So that was my first of many forays into envelope stuffing and activism. So I will now share my screen so you can see my presentation. So what I'm going to do is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to set the context. So what does that mean, housing from a woman's perspective? I'm going to then get into a discussion of discrimination and how it manifests. How does sexism manifest, and how does it intersect with race, class, and all other protected classes, which I will explain what that is in fair housing parlance. And then the last thing that I'll talk about is solutions. So how do we solve the problem of continued discrimination against women, especially women of color? And I'm going to talk about two things: organizing and public policy. And I'm going to intersperse this with some stories. Stories of the women that I have organized, worked with through the decades. I plumbed all of my files, photographs that I took, people that I worked with when I worked in Brooklyn. I got my first, I guess you could say I got my teeth cut on activism as an organizer in Brooklyn, where I was born, for about 3.5 years, first as a tenant organizer and then as the director of organizing for what was then called St. Nicholas Neighborhood Preservation Corporation. I must have organized about 75 buildings in Williamsburg and Greenpoint over the course of those 3.5 years, managed 5 buildings in receivership, and worked with tenants of all backgrounds. And I still think those were probably the headiest days of my life. And to think that I was only, those were the years from about 22 to 26 years old, roughly. So I want to get started. So just to get started, when I got, so setting the context, when Iris asked me to speak, one of my first thoughts about women and fair housing was about Virginia Woolf. I don't know how many of you read A Room of Her Own by A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. And the famous line in there is she talks about having 500 pounds a year and a room of your own. And that's what you need to be an artist. And I think back on the very first time that I thought of being an activist around housing, and it's even is while I was in college. This woman that you see here, her name is Marie Gomez. She was an immigrant from the Cape Verde Islands, which is a Portuguese speaking, or Portugal. And she was an assistant to a dentist who lived in this building in Paris, where I spent a semester to spend some time with my family. My mother is French, but my family, they were factory workers. They could not afford to have me stay with them. So I stayed in this building on the top floor in what were called maids' rooms. And this was a woman that I met over our common toilet. The light bulb was out. And we became friends. And I don't know if you can see in the back is a mirror, and you can see a little boy, that's her son, David, who is peering out, looking. And we, as I say, we became friends. But quickly, it turned out that the host mother that I had there was a racist. She said, she was commenting on Marie, and she said, I don't know why you named your son David. That's a name you would only give somebody who's going to be something when they grow up. And I was so appalled by that. And then she was also anti-Semitic, and she insulted me. And I won't get into all of that except to say that I got relocated. Oh, and before that, she cut the heat off in the room that I was in, which was next to Marie's when they went away. And I came back from there, and my mother's actually a Holocaust survivor, and I learned more about my family's history when I was there. So when I went back to Oberlin, where I went to college, I was determined that I wanted to do something around these issues, especially around racism. And I ended up in my senior year starting a tenants' rights advocacy, organizing an advocacy program for students and also for people in the town of Oberlin, mostly Black, who faced discrimination. And I was determined when I left Oberlin that I wanted to be an organizer. Actually, I almost went into energy conservation. My friend Tom Sahajian is on the line. I met him and I thought in an internship, I thought, well, maybe I'll do energy conservation. But I ended up, as fate would have it, becoming an organizer. So we have a room of her own. So Marie had a room of her own, but you also need money. And if I had somebody should give me $1 for any time somebody asked me, where am I gonna go? All the tenants who are being evicted, no matter whether they were in Brooklyn or Winnetka or Evanston or Hayward, California, asked me, where am I gonna go? And these are pictures that I took. On the bottom from Hayward, this was a woman who lived in worker housing. I briefly was organizing there. On the bottom is in Highwood. The woman on the left in the black shirt was a shop steward in a laundry that was next door, and also organizing residents against eviction and substandard conditions. And on the top is actually organizers who were working for me horsing around and pretending, that's Robert pretending to say, I want the rent, and Fran, who was a tenant that I then hired as an organizer, saying, please have mercy on me. But people say that a woman's place is in the home. So what does that mean? women have been relegated to the home, of what I call patriarchy's straitjacket, but it's also reality. If you're a mother, if you're a caretaker, here are two women, a 101-year-old woman who was in the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, retired, her 72-year-old daughter and their caregiver. In Bushwick, Brooklyn, they were being evicted because a new landlord wanted their apartment. And talk about intersectionality. These women, the 101-year-old did not speak English. She was Italian. Her husband had been discriminated against because he was Italian and could not find any decent jobs, which led to the family's overall impoverishment. But when I think of what women need, so I went back to the book by Virginia Woolf, and she talks about how her aunt had left her 500 pounds a year forever. And then I read here in the book, she said, of the two, and women, when she wrote this book, women had just gotten the vote. She said, of the two, the vote and the money I owned seemed infinitely the more important. So when you come back 100 years from when Virginia Woolf wrote, what you find is that equality, women need that 500 pounds a year, need that income, need that room of our own, but we're past that. We need that base, but we also need equity. And by equity, I mean that ability to make the community that we want, to be able to form a cohesive, beloved community in which men and women are liberated from the overall straitjacket of the patriarchy, which I would include that as housing as a commodity. So that's the context as well. When you have housing that you have to pay for, you don't have a right to housing. Women are especially vulnerable because they earn less. And if they earn less and they can't maintain a home for their children, if they are alone, then they're especially vulnerable to having to move and to losing their housing and to living in substandard housing. What I have here in this picture is from Wilmette back in 2002. These are three women. The one in the middle I'm still friends with, Lolly Watt, when she and other neighbors meeting over a soccer field, watching their children play soccer, wondering how it is that a 17-acre parcel with 450 trees and a historic building could be simply torn down and sold under the nose of the village to a speculator. This is real. And you're going to learn a secret about me right now that not a whole lot of people know, which is that I'm not exactly, I do housing work, not because I love housing, but because I love empowerment. And when I was in New York organizing, this is a picture I took. This is that 72-year-old woman when her mother could not come to housing court that day because of her infirmities, but we won. We won against this landlord who was evicting them. This was our victory. These were other organizers. The lawyer, Lisa Pearlstein, I remember on the bottom right, cheering on that when women control their own housing, we empower ourselves. And that's especially the case when there are, in fact, laws to protect you. But even without that, when you organize, when you empower yourself, you find meaning in your life. So now I'm going to get into discrimination, and the heart of this talk is how does discrimination manifest itself in housing for women? So first of all, you've got what I would call, or others have called, intersectionality, because a lot of times when people talk about the women's movement, unfortunately, they think of white women. But in my experience, of course, it's women and something else. And when you're talking about fair housing discrimination, you're really talking about women who are being discriminated against, not only because of our gender, but also because of something else that is integral to who we are. Race, especially racial segregation, women who are not white, women who are also of a different ethnic group, age segregation. So low income women who are older women face hardships in trying to find housing that, that they can secure. Presence of children is a huge issue. Landlords, even though it's a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against children in a household, it happens all the time. And systemic, so here we're talking about systemic issues. So I can get into this a little bit later, but suffice it to say that school funding in Illinois is primarily through the property tax. So if the property tax is funding your local schools, there is no incentive for a local government to approve of having more children, because if you've got more children crowding the schools, you got to build more schools, or you have larger class sizes, and you've got all of those things that people think will lower the property value. So, so you find a lot of housing that is not meant for families with children, and it's a huge problem. And then you've got other issues: sexual orientation, gender identity. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Marital status, religion, disability, and source of income. For example, women who pay their rent with child support or vouchers suffer discrimination. And when I say a house is not a home, you think about a home and you think about a place of security. You think about a place where you can be that artist that Virginia Woolf talks about, or you can be somebody who nurtures your family or friends. But when you're in a situation where a house is only valued by dollars, and the people who live there have to be, higher income, so that, the community can advertise itself as this wonderful luxury place. You remove the possibility of a secure tenure. I was once at a talk where somebody said the only difference between a tenant and a homeowner in terms of how they care for their home are three things. Are they secure? Do they have a lease? Is the cost affordable? And the other piece is it quality housing? Is it not substandard housing? Those are the three things that are important, most important. And in my organizing, I touched upon all three of these things. And the other piece is that blended families, we don't live, which again is a systemic issue. Housing is not built in this country generally for blended families, for intergenerational families, because of our, the way our culture is. So in terms of specific violations, domestic violence is probably the number one issue, I would say, around problems that women face in housing. In homelessness, 57% of all women who are in shelters experience some form of domestic violence. That's probably an undercount. For women with children, 80% of them are homeless because of domestic violence. And in terms of the intersection with race, and this is some data that I crunched a couple of years ago when I worked for All Chicago, I was floored by the data, which is that when you look at families with children experiencing homelessness in the city of Chicago, 91% were Black or Latina. And that's virtually all homeless families in Chicago. And the other violation, as I mentioned, is housing. That's for young professionals and empty nesters. I'm sure you've got that in all your cities if you're, not in the Chicago area. That is housing that is not really for low-income seniors, not for families with children, but for these, these mythical, wealthy, young professionals, as you see here. So the other violation, as I mentioned, gender status. When I did a training session for social workers working with homeless populations in Chicago, the #1 issue that they mentioned is African-American trans women are the most likely to be discriminated against in securing housing out of homelessness. The other piece, when I mentioned sexual harassment in landlords, this happens all the time where women have been harassed by landlords to, essentially have sex, or, they'll be evicted. These are things that, and I know Alicia is here, but remember that we got those kinds of calls back at Open Communities frequently, too frequently for comfort. And these crime-free rental ordinances don't help. These are communities, and it's taken off like wildfire around the country, where municipalities make landlords initiate eviction proceedings in situations where, for example, there are at least 3 calls in a year to police coming from a unit. Well, oftentimes those calls are women complaining about a batterer. And so I talked to the head of the Illinois, she made a presentation, Domestic Violence Coalition, who said that these crime-free ordinances set the DV movement back 50 years because women are now afraid to call the police. And then the other, as I mentioned earlier, landlords who discriminate despite protections against women who might have housing choice vouchers. Often they are, in Cook County, they're disproportionately single African-American mothers, so it coincides as well with race and familial status. I wanted to touch briefly on mortgage lending. This is still egregious. Women who apply for mortgages on their own, or who apply as the primary applicant along with a male, are still discriminated against more than men are. Women alone are also discriminated against much more. And as you can see in this chart, based on race, that the discrimination is even worse, especially for African-American women. This is still a problem. This is a study from just a few years ago by the Woodstock Institute. So women still are not getting that room of her own. So what are some of these effects? And this, by the way, is a family in Brooklyn that this was the tenant association president of a building that I worked with. So in the intersectionality, so women suffer substandard housing for fear of complaining, especially Black and brown women in segregated low-income neighborhoods. Black grandmothers are more likely than whites to be raising dependents. Women have exponentially less wealth than men, especially women of color, and women age alone and earn less. So 69% of the 12 million people over age 65 who are living alone are women, which is actually going down. And only 33% of them say that they are, quote, comfortably off, meaning financially well off. So only 33%. And older adults living alone, which is the population I'm serving right now at home, are roughly twice as likely, this is from Pew, as those who live with others to say they don't even have enough to meet basic expenses. So being a poor older woman is not, is not a fun prospect. But there are solutions. I want to give you some sense of hope. Organizing to me is the best solution. Organizing is a form of self-empowerment for women. Organizing capitalizes on women's strengths in terms of seeing housing as the basis of community and the primacy of relationships. So generally, and when I say women, there are, of course, men who have that same orientation. So I'm going to basically use women as a kind of a style. It's a style that values relationships above the immediate win. And what I have here is, again, this is the tenant and her daughter at a tenants meeting in Brooklyn. And then many years later, these women here formed Winnetka as Neighborly to foster affordable housing and fairness. And interestingly enough, even just the name that they picked, Winnetka as Neighborly, it's about a vision of what they wanted their community to be. And it wasn't about, we want affordable housing. No, we want a neighborly, inclusive community. And that I attribute to what women bring to the table when they are organizing. And organizing can also be a springboard to future activism and in community or political leadership. And women also, spend some time celebrating. I've been at many a party. And in fact, when I talk about leadership, if you look at this picture, and you'll see me with dark hair on the right, but on the bottom left is Rosie Mendez. And if some of you know Rosie, I hired her to be an organizer. She grew up in public housing in Williamsburg. And later on, she went to law school and she became a member of the city council in New York. So being an organizer herself was a springboard to political action. And women's organizing style, again, is about strengthening relationships as a means as well as an end. Fostering broad and meaningful participation. One of the things that I did as a tenant organizer is not emphasize who's the president of the association, but spread out the leadership. Who's collecting the rents and who's doing the flyers and all of these things. So everybody has a role. Exercising patience and flexibility and having a vision. And I'm a big fan of Ella Baker, who said, I have this quote here, "I've always thought that what is needed is the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as in developing leadership of others." And here are some examples of some successful leadership. So the North Shore Summer Project, it was really women. I mean, people talk about Dr. Martin Luther King speaking on the Winnetka Green, but who brought Dr. King there? Well, it was women who organized against discrimination for civil rights on the North Shore in the 60s after going to Selma. And on the right, I actually wrote a little history of this. Jean Cleland and Karen Chavers were friends, and as well as having worked in the movement. Jean was part of the original North Shore Summer Project. And you have here, let's see, I think, You might know Carol Kleiman, who was a journalist, is the woman in the blue suit. This was a reunion we had. And then here's some other examples in Brooklyn. You know, organizing is also a way to bring people together across race. The woman on the right with the children was from my Brooklyn days. She was actually an alcoholic on public aid who, you know, kept having a lot of children. And she, when I said her building organized, I said, how about you be the one to collect the rents? She became the rent collector, and then she had a talent for photography. And I said, well, we could publish your photographs in our neighborhood newspaper. So she took some photos, and it really transformed her to be part of our organizing. This here is, Alicia here is on the back. This is when we worked together with the tenants of North Shore Estates in Highwood, fighting displacement by the city. This is them in City Hall talking to the city, saying, don't allow speculators to sell our building out from under us. And here is Nan Parson from Park Ridge standing up. This was various human relations commissions coming together. This was in the Northbrook Village Hall. And then this wonderful story, which is about Vivian Harris in the middle. So this, without getting into the entire story, but it's a wonderful one, where this woman was part of a swimming group in Evanston at the Y. She was being harassed by a very racist neighbor who had just moved into a foreclosed home. They were renting, and they were doing all kinds of things, stalking Vivian, racial epithets, even stealing things from her patio. She said that to her fellow swim teammates. The woman on the left, Carol, is a retired English teacher, and she decided to help galvanize the community, which we did. We went to court. We got a, order of protection. Ultimately, the woman, the family next door moved, but the village of Skokie's police was less, let's say, less than just to Vivian. They even said to her, why don't you just go home and bake cookies? So I helped to broker a meeting for Vivian with the chief of police and a trustee. And Vivian was able to tell her story. And that trustee, after all that, looked her in the eye and said, I hear you, Mrs. Harris. And, it was just so touching. And Vivian brought her granddaughter, so her granddaughter could witness that. So solutions. This is probably what a lot of you want to hear about policy. Obviously, enforce fair housing laws, because they're not actually enforced very well, and fair lending laws. Pay equity, that's an obvious one. Women are still paid 77 cents to the male dollar. Make home improvement grants to low-income seniors. This is what we see in Chicago. Seniors who are living in substandard housing, their own homes, and they simply don't have the money. They're not even getting, that gets back to the fair housing. They can't even get sometimes a homeowner's insurance, which means they can't borrow money. Mandate mixed income housing, obviously. It shouldn't be, all luxury housing doesn't serve anybody except for the very rich. Eliminate any disincentives for housing for families. As I said, we've got to do something about ending majority school funding through the local property tax. We need to do more through housing first sorts of strategies for homeless mothers and children. I know that is happening, but more can be done. Again, those three conditions for renters: secure tenure, stable cost, and high quality, and which gets me to these crime-free ordinances. We don't need cops, we need code enforcement. We need inspectors to go into these buildings and find landlords. What the police should be doing is taking domestic violence a whole lot more seriously. And then other solutions, revolutionize home design. This is a resident of one of our home buildings at Natalie Salmon House. We're redesigning a room, and she's showing a little map of what she'd love to see the room be. The residents are redesigning this room. We need to have more intergenerational housing, including housing that accommodates grand families, community land trusts that take housing off the speculative market, more home sharing, shared housing, design that draws people out. So community spaces, we need a lot more indoor community spaces than we have. And here's another example. This is at home at Pat Crowley House. These are a couple of senior women, and these are two in the middle, two sisters who are actually trans women who, which is such a wonderful thing. We're not only able to house seniors, but we're able to house young people, you know, who get both housing and employment and each other. Have a vision. This was developed by, remember when I showed those Mallinckrodt women? Well, trying to get a referendum passed to save the building, they came up with these wonderful promotional materials. And I love this one. You know, you don't want that bottom right keeping you out. That's a negative vision. And it worked because we won the referendum. And that building is still there. It's actually mixed income housing. And then I was going to play you like a little video, which I don't have time to do, but this woman from Williamsburg who this is how she looks when she says, "My community is my heaven." And she was organizing at the, you know, over at the time. So, and then here's some of the celebrations, whether it's in Williamsburg or Wilmette. If we come together, we really can get things done. And I am going to stop sharing my screen at this point. I think I said quite a lot here, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that housing is a women's issue, but it's also an issue that can be solved through the act of coming together, through organizing, through attaining the basics of money and a room, but also equity, the issue of equity, building a community together across race and class. So thank you.
Thank you, Gail. I've been listening to some Zooms and doing some reading recently. And one thing I learned is if you want to help people, you need to learn from the organizers. And I think we learned a lot today. And I'm going to open it up for questioning or comments. If anybody has comments, you can either physically raise your hand or yell out or contact us on chat if you have a question, or raise your hand if you have a question. And we will just open it up for questioning now. So Ed, if you could unmute people, or people can unmute themselves. Does anybody like to start with a question or a comment?
Hi, this is Peggy. I have a question.
Okay, Peggy.
Sorry, I think I was talking right at the same time as someone else, but my question relates to a comment that Gail said with respect to a lot of housing not meant for families with children. In the village in which I live, there is a lot of development going on, a lot of building, some multiple unit housing, mostly apartments, I think, are the most recent ones. And when people in the community question our village board about so much development and its impact on our local school district, which recently had to have a referendum to raise more money because there are so many kids going to school. Anyway, so the village response is, hey, you don't have to worry about it because this housing is not built for families. It's built for, young people, young professionals, and empty nesters. Exactly the same comment that Gail mentioned here. How should we respond? I mean, um, when those kinds of comments are so blithely made to make our village, consider affordable housing options as they are, developing so much new housing in our village.
Yeah, I'm just curious, what did you want to name your village, or, or you don't have to.
Not at this time.
Okay. Well, first of all, one thing you can say just off the bat is, do you have a housing plan? What does your comprehensive plan say? I mean, is there actually even a need for this kind of housing that's been identified? And the other is just from a legal standpoint, there is something called the Housing for Older Persons Act, or HOPA, that was under the Clinton administration, which says that housing can only be, you can have senior housing, or you can have housing that's 80-20, 80% people 55 and over, 20% other. But the point is that there has to be a designation. So you can't have these quote unquote de facto senior buildings, or buildings where, because there are a number of those. Think about if you're in Wilmette around Plaza del Lago, all those buildings are like, you think of them as senior buildings, but they're not. So what they're doing is, and actually I went after one of those, and we want a case, a lawsuit against them. But in any event, you can't discriminate against families with children and not, in fact, be a senior building. So, the other thought is, if you're going to do mixed income housing, it doesn't work if what's there is only a homogeneous population that's, in one bedrooms or studios. There was a case in Evanston where they were trying to do housing. They were trying to say it was student housing, but Northwestern didn't even ask for it. I think that's proliferating in a lot of cities, these sort of student furnished studios for students.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hi, Gail. It's Sue.
Hi.
Hi. So could you speak a little bit about your village, Skokie, and how housing and the population have evolved over the last 30 or 40 years? What came first, the housing or the change in population?
Oh, why is Skokie? So for people who don't know Skokie's actually a fairly racially and economically diverse community, relatively speaking. How did it happen? First of all, it's one of those quote unquote inner ring suburbs, meaning that being close to Chicago, it had a larger number of blue collar jobs, industry, shopping, and multifamily housing. I mean, when you've got the presence of multifamily housing and you don't have, 80 to 90% single family homes, you're more likely to have a diverse population. So that happened first. However, Skokie did not have its first Black homeowner until 1960. And I know that because I talked to the white man who sold them the house as part of a sort of a civil rights, kind of contract buying, or not contract buying. They bought the house for the family and then gave it to the family. And they spent the first night, the white family, in the house and were pelted with bricks, and the police did not even help. And this is only 1960. So, but things did slowly, slowly change. Somehow the village actually did express pride in its diversity. A lot of immigrants started to come in from different countries, and that actually helped. I mean, there's a lot to be said for actually expressing support for more diversity. But it wasn't easy. When I started at Interfaith in 1993, we were getting a lot of complaints from Skokie. Oh, what was that?
The taxi cab issue in Skokie.
Yeah, that was the one thing that I worked on where it was all men. But these were, yeah, this is one of those areas in which a village or government thinking that they're being fair to everybody is actually being unfair. So this was the village saying, well, we ban, commercial vehicles from parking on the street. So, so why shouldn't we include taxi cabs in that? Well, the problem was the majority of cab drivers were Black, Pakistani, or Muslim. And so, and if they couldn't park on the street, they did not have garages. They didn't have, they would have to move out of the village, in other words. The village was doing something that would make people actually have to leave, that had a disparate impact on people of color and people who were Muslim. So we organized. That was a situation where we worked closely with the taxi cab organizing project, got 50 cab drivers at the village board meeting, and the village reversed itself. But that's an important thing for any of you who are aspiring to be or on a local government. Don't think that what you might do might not have a fair housing impact. You think it's about parking, but it's not about parking.
I guess I can speak now.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Gail.
Hi.
Gail is my high school classmate. I'm so proud and happy to be here. I'm actually tapping into this from Baltimore. And I'm an attorney here in Maryland, and I am not an organizer, but about a year ago, I decided that I was going to start doing some tenant advocacy. Here in Baltimore, where approximately the city is approximately 65% Black, at least 50% of those individuals live below the poverty line. And so the Pro Bono Resource Center here in Maryland decided that they were going to launch a new clinic, hoping to get attorneys to participate and help those who did not have representation when they went to, they call it rent court here. And I will tell you that I was absolutely horrified that those individuals who are not represented, it's just absolutely horrifying how the system is, I don't want to, it makes me kind of emotional, but it's just absolutely sickening to me that there are people here that have lost their homes, lost their apartments for like less than $100. They don't have an advocate that can say, well, wait a minute, was this landlord licensed, or any of the things that, an advocate would be able to present in order to at least prolong or give the tenant an opportunity to get some more money together. And so all that to say, and I know I'm giving you a long version, but all that to say, I'm really happy to be here and to listen to this presentation, Gail, because it keeps me energized, because it's not, it may not, from where I sit, I see some, just like you, some really sad situations, but I get energized from being in this situation and being able to listen to presentations like these. So just thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad, Sheila, you mentioned that, because, that's something that now might want to think of doing, which is, even just going to court with people. I am not an attorney, but when I was in New York, I was there with tenants. I was there with tenant associations. The judges were okay with it. Sometimes a landlord lawyer would say, what's this woman doing? Why is she allowed to approach the bench? And the judges just knew, like, that the tenants didn't have any other representation. So there's a lot of value in a lay leader coming in. And, that's why I tell my daughter this. That's why I decided I didn't want to go to law school after the case of the Tumbarellos. The case was ultimately, we got so much press, we got the TV cameras out. When the case came to be heard, we all silently stood up. When the case was called, the attorney went up with the Tumbarellos, and then the judge threw the case out. I mean, there was a technicality, but, I know that it had to do with our organizing.
Lori Pennick, I would like to appreciate Gail for all that she has done, and have known her fair housing history for a great while. But Gail, and you are aware of this, I'm sure, but what's happening now with particularly evictions due to non-payment of COVID and others, but in the communities of color, the evictions are much higher, and that technically isn't fair housing, but yet it is. And in addition to all of that, what's happened now with the primary places being in such demand, and this is women of all races and all classes, but primarily lower income women of color with disabilities. I had a woman call me and say, because I too am a lawyer, civil rights lawyer, Gail knows me, and she said that they told her she could not bring her wheelchair into the apartment. She became disabled and was wheelchair bound, and access living with market breast and all of that. But this happened, but this year, 2020, for someone to be told they cannot bring a wheelchair into a building is beyond belief for me, given the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disability Act. Where are, and I referred them to a Legal Aid Chicago, but the trainings of landlords that, and this is Chicago, I'm not talking the suburbs, the trainings of landlords and homeowners, and this was a big building. I think there were 40 units in the building. It wasn't, 1 or 2 floors. But the training that used to go on and you participated in terms of the real estate and the housing industry, is that no longer existence? How can someone say professionally tell someone, well, you can't come in because you have a wheelchair? I mean, how is that possible in 2020?
It shouldn't be. I mean, that's insane.
That's exactly.
I mean, that's a total violation. I mean, you had a good question too in terms of COVID. I mean, I know that there's an eviction moratorium going on, but I don't know exactly how that's working. Now that I'm a little removed from it. I don't know, I don't know, Ori, if you're in touch with the Jane Addams Senior Caucus, if they're doing anything about that. I love the fact that they got, yeah. Uh-huh.
I am not, because I'm retired, although I'm working harder now than I did when I was getting paid. But no, and I haven't been, and that's a great, I should have had them reach out to them. What I just did was, because this woman wasn't poor, but she didn't have money for a private attorney. So I gave her, I told her to call Corporation Counsel. I mean, the Corporation Counsel of Chicago should know this building is saying that. But then I gave her to, because she really wasn't a senior. This woman was like in her 40s, and her disability is, it's complicated, but she wasn't a senior. This was a disabled Black woman who had a cane when she first went to look at the apartment, but she became wheelchair bound because of, what happens. And they told her she could not she could not look at the apartment or even, because of her wheelchair. So I'm saying to you that, and I was speechless when she told me, because I'm like, this is 2020, nobody in their right mind would even say that. But it was said. And a building on the south side of Chicago. So again, and this is in a predominantly Black, community. So we're not even talking about just racial discrimination, as we know from segregation and the like, but we're now talking, discrimination of a multitude of facets. And one, you talked about familial status, whether they're children and, seniors, but now, again, in the city of access living, how could someone even dare say that? But and I think some of it, again, because of COVID, people are, units are being, it's like you're lucky to get a good one if you can. And this was not a very expensive one, but again, this person was told she could not even look to rent it because she was wheelchair bound.
Well, and the other part of it too, and Ori, by the way, is very modest. She used to run the granddaddy of all fair housing organizations in the country, the Leadership Council for Metropolitan Open Communities. But, that was the days when there was a lot more education. No one is in your face really anymore around
that's right.
fair housing and educating the public or realtors. It's just gone.
Okay, I see that Helen has a question. She's had her hand up for a while. And then after we do Helen, we're going to go to the chat because there's some good questions on chat. But Helen, if you want to.
Oh, thank you. Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, Gail, thanks so much for your presentation. I know housing is a major human issue, but until your presentation, I really hadn't thought of what a feminist issue it is. And I guess you did, I was going to ask you about Jane Addams Senior Caucus. I'm a member, not an active one, but I think they have a big contingent working on housing. And I'm wondering if they work with you much and if you work with them, and are there other organizations that you work with or that you would recommend that we get involved with?
Yeah, the Jane Addams Senior Caucus, one of the things that they just did, they worked with Maria Haddon, who's a relatively new alderman in Chicago in the 49th Ward, Rogers Park, to get an ordinance passed that during COVID, there'll be mandatory checks on older adults in senior buildings, which is a really good thing. And that was, the caucus was heavily involved in that. And they've been working on a Senior Tenants Bill of Rights. I think they're in a little flux right now because they're looking for a new director, but other groups, there's the Metropolitan Tenants Organization in Chicago. I'm trying to think of who else. There is an organization, I'm just suddenly blanking on their name, the Chicago Housing Coalition, something like that. They've been working really hard around pushing for inclusionary zoning in the city. And there's the right to the Grassroots Collaborative. I think that's what they're called. They've been doing a lot of work. But those were, those would be some of the groups. There's just seems to me, I've been around so long. I've been living in the Chicago area for 30 years now, and the number of groups doing organizing and advocacy has actually gone down. Although where a lot of the ferment is a lot of fabulous Black Lives Matter organizing, groups against, mass incarceration. And there's been a lot of great energy there, but not as much, it seems like, on housing.
Yeah. Well, didn't we recently get a law passed, or I'm not sure what happened to it, that if you have a criminal history that you still have to be able to rent an apartment, it can't be held against you, something like that?
Yeah, that was added, exactly. That was that is probably the latest sort of fair housing victory, is adding that about a arrest record as a protected category, because it has a racial impact. more African Americans get arrested for no reason than anybody else, but it kind of shows up.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Okay, I see a question from Lori Goldstein. Lori, she says, thank you for the presentation. Can you explain more about what a land trust is?
Oh, it's one of my favorite things. A community land, Betty Esther's on the call. She founded a community land trust in Evanston. A community land trust is where you separate out the right to own the land from the right to own the building or the quote unquote improvement that sits on the land. So in other words, you can have a nonprofit that owns the land and they own it forever, kind of like a, you know, like a park or something like that. And anything that goes on it, because it's off the speculative market, you take away the cost of, you know, the speculative cost of the land from improvements on it, which means it makes it easier to develop affordable housing that stays affordable forever. And Highland Park has a community land trust. Actually, it's broadened. There's some land trust properties in other places. There are community land trusts around the country. It's to me, it's the best way to do affordable housing because it combines, you know, fair and open governance, because there's a structure of having people who live in land trust property have to be on the board. It can be rental and ownership, by the way, and other community members, and then it just stays affordable forever. So when a person moves out of a land trust house, they sell it back to the land trust. They get a little bit of, you know, 3% appreciation or whatever they get. But it's a much better, not only does it keep affordable housing affordable forever, but you know, but it also means that subsidies that are needed are less than it would be if it was just a typical kind of other subsidy. Because think about it, the cost of land and housing always outpaces the raises that people get, incomes. So over time, there's always going to need to be more that gap between income and cost is only going to go up as the years go by. So if you can control the cost of the land, the subsidy is always going to be less.
Okay, I see that Susan had two questions. The first one, I think you might have touched on somewhat. It was long ago that Dr. King visited Winnetka and the North Shore remains segregated. Are we losing ground on the issue of housing fairness? That's the first question. And her second question is, how can low-income housing be funded?
Mm-hmm. On the first question, yeah, I mean, the problem is it's two words, political will. There is just about no political will to do affordable housing, which is why I go back to using a different strategy to make it happen. How about talking about what kind of community do we want? If you say to people, well, I'd love to have, you know, I'd love to have an artist live here. I'd love to have, you know, the first responders live here. I'd like to have the caregiver live here. You know, I'd like to have the cleaning lady live, you know. People can come together on that, and then suddenly you're really talking about mixed income communities, but you have to have the political will. It seems to be going up a little bit since the George Floyd murder. People are starting to see a link between affordable housing and racial integration, because if just like women earn less, African Americans earn less than whites, and you know, so that's why they're linked. So now that there's a little bit more interest, and rightly so, in ending white supremacy and systemic racism, there seems to be a little bit more interest in affordable or mixed income housing. So we did lose ground. I mean, you know, Winnetka isn't any more racially integrated than it was. But what I'm hoping is that now that people are more sensitized they're putting some pressure, and that's the other bottom line, political will, or the corollary. To make political will a reality, it takes people on the bottom. It takes the voters telling their elected officials that's what they want. And then I forget the second part of it.
Well, the second question was, how can low income housing be funded?
Oh, yeah, there are a variety of sources. The state of Illinois has some funding. There's some federal funding. There's low-income housing tax credit funding. There are also some equity funds or some grants out there. I mean, it can happen. You can even do mixed, sort of a mixed income building where the higher rent units subsidize the lower rent units. I mean, if there's a will, there is a way.
Great. Betty Esther had a question. You still there, Betty? Let's see, where is she? Oh, Betty, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Good.
Sure. Okay, yes, I'm still here, like the bad penny that nobody wants to take when you go to the store. I work with Gail. When did we start meet Gail? A long, long time ago.
Oh God, like 25 years
housing.
ago, more.
Huh? Around.
Oh, that's an Amber Alert. Everybody's getting it.
Oh.
Okay. But my question, you had mentioned something which was interesting in talking about the loans and things for seniors in their home. And they are trying to find low interest loan, a loan to rehab their home or to fix it. And unfortunate, come to find out, that is something that is hard to find. And I'm working with a young lady here in Evanston, and she falls in this category, her income between 80 and 100% of the area median income. Her age is 72. So going back to work is a possibility, but she's also disabled. So that is not a possibility. And we had this issue with the city to get programs that they use some of the CDBG money for rehabbing and stuff. And we could not get the city to give her that. And so the unfortunate thing was the city took her to court to condemn her house. And then trying to find her legal assistance was hard. But we did find someone that was a lawyer who is helping her and kind of inexperienced around housing stuff. And so you like, how can we find, and have they all disappeared, the lawyers and things that we work with, and they're not there anymore. So you're trying to find them. And it's like trying to get young people to reach them, to reach out, to help build up that build an organization, build a resource and things for that. And that's kind of one thing that we fell into another organization with, working with issues around policemen and stuff. And then you have where the city has different laws that they use to evict people if the police come to your house 3 times. So we work in helping families and individuals fight those cases and stuff. And it seems like for fair housing the more ground we gain, the more we lose, because then they come up with different ideas and things. Oh, we can do this for affordable housing. And we have these here, what are they called? Accessory dwelling unit, where usually it is just 2 bedrooms, and not for families that have 3 or more kids. And how, and we looking at how do we fight that in terms of that's not fair. Can we really fight that under the fair housing issue, or we just have to just look at them come into the neighborhood and we can't stop the city for allowing them to do that, and not say that you're violating the fair housing rule when you let all these little excessive dwelling come into the city that's only for 2 people. So can we address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we should talk offline about your earlier question, but the whole thing about accessory dwelling units, we have to try to get cities to see that as that's one solution for one kind of family, but they can't, they can't, there is no one size fits all. And if they're pushing that for that, again, it borders on familial status discrimination. But I'm glad that all of the work that you've been doing with on the Citizens Network of Protection. And we'll talk later. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, so
Okay.
thank you.
Let's see. There's a question from Bev Copeland, and she wanted to know about the very enlightening book Evicted.
Oh, right. That's I have to admit that I have the book. I have not read the book, but I've read about the book, and I know it's about I know it takes place, it's about Milwaukee and the issues that especially, and it does have a very heavy female perspective on that.
It wasn't actually a question. I just wanted to make sure that, because I came in late, I just want to make sure that people knew about the book, because it was extremely enlightening and depressing at the same time.
How is it enlightening for you?
Because I didn't know that much about it. I didn't understand that once you got evicted, it was like 100% sure that you were going to get evicted again. It's like a very vicious cycle. You can't get out of that. You can't get out of that system once that has happened to you, and it's it's horrible, just horrible.
Do you know who the author is?
Yeah, I added that later. It's Matthew Desmond. I couldn't think of it initially.
Oh, I see it. Matthew Desmond. Thank you for mentioning that.
Sure.
Van Gilmer has a question. What is that alternative name for affordable housing that I saw that you had used a while back? And is there a move to change the name from affordable housing to something that does not make people think of low income? Ah, you just said it, mixed housing. Oh, there's the answer. Okay.
Yeah, I like using the term mixed income housing, because that's what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about affordable housing, we're really talking about a community that has housing for people across the spectrum.
I actually feel pushback whenever we talk about affordable housing here in the North Shore, because the image is something something different. Like they were saying some years back, a single man on drugs, a woman with a lot of children. I heard Black people. I heard, and I think mixed housing or something else. So that was a step up from low income to affordable income to maybe something else, but still to be able to allow folk to be able to live a lot of places.
Yeah, and the power of saying mixed income housing is it's not about those people. What you're doing is you're talking about all of us. It's a community that accommodates all of us.
Okay, that's all the questions I see. Is anybody else have a comment, question? Anything they wanted to add? No? Okay, well, I have a question. I just was wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the more successful efforts that we've seen here locally, more on the North Shore. Any successes or progress that you've been seeing lately?
Yeah, some, again, especially in the last few months, one very positive move has been in Wilmette, actually, and it's thanks in great part to the League of Women Voters. They have an active sort of chapter there. But actually, it stems back to community organizing. I showed you that slide there of Wilmette Cares. There have been various versions of people coming together in Wilmette around affordable housing. So, you know, we built enough of a groundswell. Again, that's many stories that I don't have time to tell, but a lot of them are really cool. That has now led the village to restart their Human Relations Commission and their Housing Commission. That's a big deal. That means a Human Relations Commission means it's going to be tasked with looking at issues of racial equity and promoting the community as inclusive and looking at what the police is doing and doing events that promote diversity. And obviously a housing commission would be charged with looking at housing needs. So that's positive. Northbrook has been very positive. There's been a wave of some really good, and actually they're, you know, mostly women who were elected into office and are seriously looking at inclusionary zoning. That's again, mixed income housing as a mandate for any new housing coming up. And that's actually going to be passed before the end of this calendar year by the village board. So that's extremely positive. Highland Park has had a suite of affordable housing programs that have actually been around now for over 15 years. But no, you know, it didn't catch on anywhere until, you know, now things are catching on more. I'm trying to think of what else that's going on that's fairly positive. People are, you know, I'm back helping to organize. So people in Winnetka are organizing. In Park Ridge, they have been organizing. And I've helped to pull together once more a grassroots campaign called the Justice Project, The March Continues, which I started before I left Open Communities, which resurrects the North Shore Summer Project 50 years later. And hopefully all of you will want to join the Justice Project, meaning, you know, what is the joining together, rallying around a regional vision of the welcoming community, but acting locally. So you could be in Northbrook working for affordable housing, say, and then reporting back every quarter or asking for help from the rest of folks from the Justice Project. I'm really excited about that. Even, you know, people, and then the other exciting thing, New Trier schools. There are young people, students that started something called Heroes. Van is part of that too, healing everyday racism in our schools. And they're helping to fuel activism around housing and other issues. So that's actually really exciting that we're getting leadership coming from the high school.
Yeah. I have a quick question for you, Gail. Do you think housing is a human right? And if so, how do we convince people that no level of homelessness is acceptable?
Yes, I do think housing is a human right. The founder of H.O.M.E, Lilo Salmon, said also housing is a human right. The problem, of course, is it's hard to have a human right at the same time that housing is also a commodity. We put a price tag on it. So the way, the way that we have to look at it, I saw that somebody had asked about what is housing first, and that is a variant on housing as a human right. It says if somebody is homeless, give them a home. Don't make them jump through hoops. Don't make them, go to sobriety classes or whatever it might be. Give them a place to live. And that has been really successful in solving homelessness for a lot of populations around the country. It started under the Obama administration with the Ending Veterans Homelessness. They started, no one who has served our country should have to be homeless. So they brought together the Veterans Administration, they got vouchers, they got landlords to, they actually track down. I mean, there is a name by name list of, homeless veterans and where are they going to go, so it takes that kind of a SWAT team approach to end homelessness. And, it has been, it has worked. I don't know if anybody here on this call has worked in the homelessness field, but that would be another, that could be an interesting topic for the future.
Yeah. I just noticed that Peter had a question in the chat. Peter, do you want to ask it or should I read it?
I could ask it.
Okay.
Hi, Gail. It's wonderful meeting you virtually, and thank you for the presentation. I think I have a pretty basic question. I don't know how to quite understand it myself. Mixed housing or how we've been talking about affordable housing. Is there a uniform way of defining or categorizing what is affordable housing? I ask that almost rhetorically because I think I know the answer is it isn't, because in some villages like Wilmette, for example, in their housing plans that they have, they base the quote unquote affordable housing on the median income of that village and a scale level based on that. And I mean, that essentially makes it unaffordable for most people. And I think that happens in many areas. So I guess my question ultimately is, in communities where you want to encourage mixed housing, encourage diversity in the area, how do you get away from that kind of definition, that kind of defining of what is considered in the umbrella of affordable housing?
Well, the way that you do it is you use one standard. I mean, Wilmette no community should be using their own median income, because that defeats the purpose. So I happen to serve on the State Housing Appeals Board that enforces the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeal Act. And it says that every community in Illinois should have at least 10% affordable housing. And the way the state defines affordable is for the metro area, not like Northbrook, Wilmette, Chicago. And the median income is determined by HUD every year. They do the calculation. I think it's roughly $80,000 a year for a family of 4. It's different based on family sizes. So an affordable unit under the state's definition for for sale housing would be at about 80% of that. So that would be roughly $60,000 a year, affording a house of $200,000. So it's not, it's not a cheap, inexpensive house, but it's less than, what the market is in Wilmette. And for rental, it's 60% of the median, which is about $40,000 a year. So, and that's a 2-bedroom apartment of about roughly $1,000 to $1,200 a month. These are not actually inexpensive prices, but that's the standard. So the answer to your question is there needs to be one standard. If, the issue of lack of adequate stock of housing for people at certain income levels is a regional problem. It's not a local problem. If people are driving on the Eden's Expressway spewing, fumes as they go to their Northbrook job and they're going through Wilmette or whatever, we all care about that, So that's my answer, that, it's got to be one standard, and that is the standard.
Thank you.
Sure. And one last thing I would add is another issue is vouchers. So I don't know if my friend Janet Smith is still on the line, but I learned from her that the way to look at housing is you look at the supply side and the demand side. So the supply side is, do we have a supply of housing that's affordable to people earning, $40,000 a year? But the demand side is, wow, we've got housing that's, $1,500 a month, but people only earn, can only spend $1,000 a month. Can we make up that income difference? And that's the voucher. That's a voucher strategy. So that's a demand side strategy to help people afford their housing.
The reason I asked that question was because, as you mentioned, in Wilmette and hopefully in other villages where there be more current assessment of the housing need, rather than having their own definition, you'll start off the discussion with an agreed upon uniform evaluation, so that it would not be just quote unquote affordable housing on paper, but it truly would be, and people just feeling good about themselves that they met their own defined definition of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're running out of time. I just wanted to thank Gail again for joining us, educating us. It's been fascinating. And if anybody, unless anybody has any other questions or comments, I just wanted to make a few announcements for some future events that are coming up in our organization. I just want to mention, first of all, that on Saturday, November 21st, the Illinois Now is having their 2020 annual conference. It's a virtual conference called Unlocking Our Future, a Feminist Vision for a More Just World. For more information and instructions how to register, you can visit Illinois Now's website at ilnow.org. And then for our chapter on December 16th, we're going to close out 2020 with a membership meeting where we're going to talk about, review what we've accomplished during this year and what we plan to do for the future. So there'll be more information about that. Does anyone have anything else to share? Or any more questions before we adjourn?
Oh, I was just going to mention,
Yes,
Iris, in response to you, this is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
As far as the conference on Saturday, I went to register for the conference on Eventbrite, and it said that they were no longer taking registrations. So I wrote to Laura Welsh on Facebook, and she said she's trying to fix that. So if other people have problems, they should contact us.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks for mentioning that.
Okay, and Iris, you verified the date of the next Now meeting. Did you say the 16th, which is that's a Wednesday, not a Monday?
That's correct.
Okay.
Normally we're going back to Wednesdays, which we normally used to always do, but the last couple of times we've switched it to Mondays, but we are going to go back to Wednesday on December 16th. So look forward to seeing you there. December 16th. So anyway, thanks for joining, everybody, and great questions, great information. And Gail, I will be in touch with you to find out more ways of how our group can work with you and learn more and find out ways that we can assist.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Iris. This was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.